Okay, we are live. It's good to see you. Lisa, I think before we even kick off, we should talk about the name of this live, because we
Yeah.
were back and forth about it.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a few things about it before I say anything?
Yeah. So, should women's issues be discussed in the workplace? That's the name we we came up with together. And I work as I'm Lisa. I work as a women's health coach and educator, working with clients and then also with professionals. And I have some experience working in the workplace as well. And yeah, I think it's just, I don't think either of us are coming here. I'm certainly not coming here with the answer to that question. Like it's not so much a question that we can answer with either a yes or no, but rather it is definitely a question I think people think about from what I've seen. It's a question I've thought about. Even when I'm working, doing a workshop in the workplace, people, are asking themselves this question and where responsibility lies and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a bit of irony in the question, but I think it does make for an interesting discussion and thinking point in terms of women's health, what is women's issues, even that word issues, and because the reality is we are in the workplace and we have bodies and we have experiences and they have an impact on our work and our interactions in the workplace. So I think it definitely is a really good topic to explore and discuss and think about. Curious what you think about it, Sheila.
Yes. So my issue is with the word issue, but at the same time, if we're thinking about how other people talk about it, they talk about it, even though they say women's health and stuff. It's often talked about as like a deficit thing or something that we need to address, like that type of tone. Um, and I think, there's a couple of things in the question, which is, do people want to discuss it?
Mm-hmm.
Is it relevant to discuss it? Where are organizations like legally responsible, in terms of different needs and things? But also, I think that sometimes politically, like, and I talk about this a good bit in the work, we could have a very particular position politically in society, but then organization, because that context is very specific and has different remits to it, the things that we might assume should or shouldn't move between them can be different, I think. So, for instance, I don't know if I want to talk about abortion in the workplace, generally speaking, but I do probably want to talk about it out in society, as part of maturing the conversation and understanding things and considering people's experiences. But I might not want a general conversation in my workplace about it, and I might as well. So, like, I think there's a piece here about what people want and need and why. But like, it's interesting. I had this really interesting pushback recently when we were talking about how do we make workplaces more gender equal ultimately. And one of the arguments was, and it's a really good point, if you have any medical leave, you're entitled to that, and you're entitled to that privacy. And under the Equality Act and the disability element of that, you should only need to share your needs. Disclosing your condition is not a requirement for anybody experiencing a disability, let's say. And then in terms of medical needs, actually, it's only the need that needs to be disclosed, not the condition or the requirement. So if we think about the side of women's issues that are linked to like medical processes, or doctor's notes or painkillers or whatever the stuff is that is medicalized, then the minute you state what it is, it's actually on your record. Now, the minute you say, oh, this policy is for this type of leave, it's on your record that you took that leave if it's a specific leave policy. Whereas if you have leave for medical reasons, whether you choose to disclose the details of that or not, it's medical leave is on your documentation. And I think that that's kind of an important thing to think about in terms of the requirement to disclose. Do you know what I mean? So if I've heard a number of women say, it's become so normalized to talk about this that I feel like I should be talking about it, even when I don't want to, even when I'd rather keep it private. So I'm curious about your thoughts around that kind of conversation.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, actually, a really good point to think about. Because I know all sorts of people, like regardless of gender, who have completely different thoughts and feelings about this, whether they're impacted or not directly. And it also kind of makes me think about, like, women's issues aren't always only medical either. Do you know what I mean? So, like I work with the menstrual cycle, and one of the things that I'm helping to get people to think about is that to not only think of their issue as a pathology, you know, or a disability. It's actually like there's a normalization that needs to happen with regards to you know, things that might like impact us and our body, but aren't necessarily like gonna not every single day. Do you know what I mean? It's slightly different. But I do think I'm a big believer in like privacy and, you know, like if I was in the workplace, like when I think back to times where I was in the workplace, I definitely felt uncomfortable thinking about having to disclose something to do with my menstrual cycle to whoever, you know. So there was a piece there around privacy, and then there was a piece around my personal need and needing a bit of time. And at the same time, it wasn't an everyday thing either, because there's a cyclical element to it. But now that I think about it, I wonder, I think there's also a piece around, you know, when it comes to women's issues, a lot of them do have all the shame and the stigma around it as well. And that kind of adds to it. And so there's something as well around, say if I was to have shame myself, and then also protecting other people from their experience of discomfort as well and shame or whatever in relation to the particular topic. So yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance in this question. Now, if I like, and I was thinking about this myself before we were getting on the chat, and I was kind of asking myself, like, what would I have liked, you know, myself when I was in the workplace, when I didn't feel really supported. I didn't really understand, like, you know, it was just kind of like, no, it was normal for me to just not talk about this stuff. But having said that, there are certain things now that I do this work that would have been helpful had they been in the workplace as options for me, you know. So not necessarily a requirement for me to have to disclose or, you know, attend talks or whatever that I didn't feel comfortable with, but rather have access to resources and supports that were just available, you know, for things I needed when it was difficult for me. So yeah, like I definitely don't think people should have to disclose the thing. And, you know, you mentioned abortion there. That's a huge topic. And I agree, like there's an element to that is political. In my work, it's kind of more on the physical side, biological side. Someone going through an abortion is going through a lot of like, or might be going through a lot of physiological stuff. And that then, similar to miscarriage or birth or anything to do with the womb, you know, it's our physiology has an impact, and we have therefore certain needs that might present around that time. And then that will have an impact on our ability to work or certain needs that we need in the workplace. But like I said, like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to disclose the actual thing. But it can be confusing though for a workplace to then, is it like a disability? Is it not? How come it's only sometimes, you know, not all the time? And that's a big question, like in the endometriosis space too, where people don't have, you know, pain all the time. Therefore, it's not technically, you know, an issue in the eyes of the workplace.
well, it's interesting because it's making me think of two things. One is dynamic disabilities. So that's like it's a disability that so a disability, like according to the definition I work with, is something that is an experience you're having that the environment disables you from engaging with from an equitable point of view. So your starting point isn't the same as others because you have additional needs that maybe aren't automatically catered for or considered. But the dynamic part is the part I think is really important around your points, because what we've done historically and again, I do think it's linked to pathologization, but it's also linked to identity, is we've often classified something as is or not. Actually, there's a lot of, and I love the term dynamic in terms of for disabilities like endometriosis, MS. There's a number of different disabilities that are dynamic because of the nature of them. They are reoccurring, they are crippling, but they are also, actually, I'm just thinking maybe that word is ableist. I'm not sure. I have to check that now. But they are like really impacting someone's ability to live, and then they also don't at other moments. You know, that kind of way. And So I think when we haven't really talked about what it looks like for people to go through cycles of experiences, like just experiences. And so it's either, especially in the workplace, a lot of accommodations are either linked to the Equality Act, where you must kind of put a need forward that's very well supported, depending on how great your team are in the workplace, or it's considered a you problem. You know, if you don't have a kind of need that you can ask for. One thing I've seen less that has been helping dynamic experiences is actually this idea of flexibility. And I don't mean, like everyone thinks I mean hours and work hours. I mean, when a workplace engages with flexibility, it's more likely to fit its employees more appropriately for their needs without requiring them to like exaggerate or disclose, or, and I say exaggerate because I've spoken to a number of people who say my condition isn't bad enough to ask for this, or my experience isn't bad enough. And I'm like, well, you are taking a lot of painkillers going into work that day, and your colleagues aren't, so you're not at the same point during that day. And then you're trying to perform, and then you've also got the emotional, and you've got the physiological, you've got the anxiety, you've got all these things. What's bad enough that you might give yourself like a more of an equitable starting point?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's this idea nothing's bad enough. So that's what I mean by the is or isn't, rather than actually.
No, just on that point, nothing is bad enough. I think that's an interesting point to kind of consider through the gender lens too, because what I see is that, like, for generations, women's issues have been kind of normalized, and, you know, that whole put up with it kind of attitude, you know, and get on with it, or like, you know, take all the painkillers or put on the brave face. You know, I've done that. I probably still do that. And there's something there around maybe permission as well, even for the individual to really look at that and see, because I think we've just normalized that for so long, that it can be hard to then really look at it and be like, oh, this is actually something that I'm going through regularly, and there is a need here for support, and I am entitled to some help or whatever, you know.
And I think that's why I like the flexibility idea, because it's not like, oh, I put in a request for something. It's like, oh, this week I'll dial into the meetings, you know, or, you know, this week I'm going to need to reduce my hours, or it is something that, now obviously that isn't always suitable. It's not always great for teams. Like, I work in the back end. There's often like it causes havoc, but the organizations that do flexibility well have a lot less of these additional masking and survival things happening in the dynamic, and they have a lot more kind of ease to how they are meeting people's needs effectively without requiring a medicalized approach, which is traditionally what's used if you ask for needs in terms of the Equality Act, even in terms of ADHD or autism. Some organizations will take the need request without a diagnosis or evidence. Many won't. They want evidence that these are valid needs to request. But if your workplace has a flexible approach, and I would go a step further, it's not just your workplace, the manager has a flexible approach within the guidelines of the workplace, then it's actually more about what helps you to work well and do well and be okay, rather than proving you're sick enough or you're bad enough or whatever.
Because I don't think it is helpful. Like, in some cases people have actual conditions, right, that are with a diagnosis. But if I have a day, or someone has a day with intense PMS or whatever, I don't think it is helpful. This is my personal opinion, right? But I don't think it is helpful to just like have to have a label that is a sickness. You know, I think there's a kind of like I said, it's normal. Like, me working with hormones and the menstrual cycle, it's normal for your hormones to go up and down. That's what they're supposed to do. Therefore, it's normal for your mood and your emotional world to also fluctuate alongside that. And for some people, they have more sensitivity to that, depending on other factors and what's going on in their life. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something kind of like, you know, that they have to have a diagnosis, let's just say. Now, some people do. And therefore, and what I've seen, and even for myself, I think the flexible approach is the most effective, because it allows the person then to discern their own need that day, and find ways to meet it within, you know, the framework of what's available. And like what I've seen with workplaces is like working from home, people find that really helpful. Or in some cases it might just be a, you know, a longer break or extended break, or I don't know, a timeout or something like that. Like, and those little moments can be really helpful for someone to just do what they need to do in that time, you know. Or like it could just be like, you know, working, if they're at home, they might be wanting to lie on the couch with a hot water bottle or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Or have access to a kitchen or to a bathroom. So yeah, I think the flexibility thing is really helpful. And what I've seen as well in some of the people I work with, when they have that, then at other times in the month or just in the week or whatever, because they haven't been doing all that masking and like sort of having to like force themselves through symptoms, they actually have more energy. So it kind of compensates, you know. It's not like, oh, we're like, I need to rest more and, you know, that's just who I am. Actually, like, it's beneficial. It's like the circadian rhythm. You rest when you need it, and then you have energy then when you have it there. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the flexible approach. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is because the Equality Act, like this is directly related to why people need diagnosis, because the Equality Act protects disabilities, people have to pursue a label to be protected.
Yeah.
From a legislative point of view. Now,
Yeah.
some organizations have it in their policy so people aren't required to do that, but their needs are being met. But one of the things I think is interesting is I teach the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging with Professional Academy and UCD. And one of the things that they do, you know, we're teaching. So there's kind of two types of people that come to this. There's people who are really interested in getting into it and know very little, but are like maybe socially active in the space of inclusion. And then there are the like really seasoned heads of department professionals who just need the paper to match what they've been doing in industry for a long time. And what I find really interesting is the interpretation of words like disability and how it's legal, like how we understand it in organizations, how it's legally compliant, like effective, and then why people are requiring diagnosis for themselves. It's all interlinked because there's the disability movement generally, and there's lots of different movements. The position I agree with is that a person is not disabled, they're disabled by the way society has designed itself. And I think that's really helpful because that gets us to say individuals aren't inherently not able, which is often what people assume unconsciously, but actually are inherently very able. And the issue is that they are disabled by their engagement. And if we take that social lens of disability instead of the legislative for a second, which is why I keep finding the difference, then anything that you engage with, that the environment isn't designed for you, that your performance, your thriving, your well-being is disabled, is something for workplaces to consider, even just from a business perspective. When your workplace is more flexible, and you'll still need boundaries, because one of the things I have found is that people who don't need accommodations are often the loudest requiring accommodations. So there's this kind of really interesting thing that happens where the people who need it often, you know, takes a while to get comfortable with, meeting the needs. You know, they have all the doubts, they have all the internalized, like there's a big process. Not everyone, but often. And then there's people who will try to like catch on the coattails, like, that phrase ambulance chasers, where like lawyers chase ambulances. There are examples of that, like, because I'm working with workplaces where people who don't have the need have tried to leverage somebody else's need, or have kind of tried to slot themselves in some way, but it happens very rarely. But the one issue is when it does happen, it puts a shadow on everyone who does need the need, who's already double doubting themselves and questioning. But if we think about that social lens of anything that stops me being able to engage from an equitable point of view, i.e., I can perform well, I can do my job well, and I'm still well at the end of the day with all of those things happening, it's a good business decision, right? You, like, short term, you can burn out your staff, you can ignore their needs. Long term, that's not a sustainable model. And I think that people are starting to realize, especially when there's more like talent competition and a lot more like needing really good talent, that actually this is an investment. It might not look like we're getting what we want today, because we're putting extra effort in now, But it's very difficult to leave a place like those golden handcuffs that meets your needs so well. Like, it's a really difficult thing to say, well, I get flexibility, I get paid well, I get respect, and there's genuine opportunity. Like, I'm just thinking of women and the traditional things that get in the way.
Yeah.
It's very hard to leave an organization where those things are in place, because
100%.
you know you're putting one of them or more at risk, even if the interview with the new place is positive. So I think if we see it as the way that social movement sees disability, which I really like, not suggesting that women's issues are related to disabilities, because I actually agree with you completely that it's actually normal. It's just we haven't normalized it in work settings because they've been designed with males in mind.
Yeah.
But there is still a learning from the social movement, which is anything that stops you being able to engage equitably and equally is you being disabled, by the environment, by the system. And that's a really powerful way, I think, that we could look at women's needs and women's health, which is actually what is happening to me that stops me having an equal experience.
Yeah, I remember when I worked in years ago in the workplace, this was kind of before all these changes were becoming normalized. So I'm not like shaming the company or anything, but it was just back then, and there was like really strict working hours, and they had one of the supports they had in place were these kind of like meetup groups called breaking sessions. And it was like a place to go and discuss why you felt broken after the work. It was like tech support. So it was like we had to like have loads of tickets on the go, and our lunch was only half an hour. It was really, really intense. And I remember thinking to myself, like I was starting to have that kind of thinking at the time, like people were going in there and they were kind of saying, I feel broken because of X, Y, and Z, men and women, all sorts of people. And I remember thinking to myself, how come I have to feel broken? Like, I'm not broken. There's something wrong with me. I'm just reacting to this system that's really intense, like I was really angry at the time. I was like, I'm not broken. The system's broken, and no one was really like getting that. But it's the same thing as what you're saying, isn't it? It's like, let's, instead of just like seeing it as a me problem, just take a look outside for a second and see how can we improve the environment or the system so that my body and my needs can kind of meet better, and build a better working relationship. And yeah, like when it comes to women's health, I mean, there's so many with the word issues, there's so many like experience, there's such a diversity in experience of women's health. The more I do this work, the more just like so many people, like even it can be confusing when you start to think about these things, because people think, oh, is this normal? Is that normal? There is no normal, even in the realm of women's health, So there's such a diversity of experience. Therefore, there will be such a diversity of different needs depending on what the individual is going through or has gone through or has in front of them, even like if you think about maternity leave as an example, maternity leave usually starts like, what is it, a few weeks before the due date, and then it's kind of there for the postpartum time. But from my experience of speaking, I'm not a mom, but speaking to moms, is that on a physiological level, the first trimester is the most sensitive in terms of like health and energy. That's the time when progesterone is like really increasing to support the rapid growth of the pregnancy. And physiologically, like a lot of women will feel really, really tired during that time. So I just know myself, if that was me, I would be like struggling to keep up, and then a whole other thing is like pregnancy not really talked about either in the first trimester. That's a whole other thing. So yeah, like there's so many different sort of ways we can like think about this. But I do think it is helpful to go back to what you said, Sheila, and think about like, what are my needs? Or if you're a leader or a manager in an organization, like what could be the needs of my female staff and within this realm of like women's health? And maybe to not, because I know that can feel kind of scary. Even the term women's health for some people can feel kind of like, oh, that's not my area. I don't know, we chatted about that on Instagram, where it was like very often it's kind of this issue over there, it's like even in school, it's like, oh, that belongs in sex ed, and
that's all sent to a private class with
only like
girls,
that,
and
it's separate from the boys, and even like, oh, like women's health, that belongs in the medical space. But like, yeah, it does if there's an issue that needs medical attention. And also I have a body and I have experiences. Another thing I wrote down as well was like, what I see a lot in my work is emotions, right? So if you're a person with a cycle, and you struggle, and every few weeks you experience really intense emotions, or you might have anger or anxiety or something like that. Your emotional experience, not always, but it can be really charged by what's happening hormonally. So if you're in the premenstrual phase, or if you're in perimenopause, when estrogen is going down, that has an impact on your nervous system. And for some people, they have less sort of capacity to sort of process those emotions or be with them, So the physiology and our hormonal fluctuations can impact how we experience emotions. And I know myself, like when I'm really angry about something, I find it so hard to focus. Like I find it really hard to focus. I can be very distracted. Or grief is another really strong emotion, and that will for sure have an impact on how I show up for work, for my creativity.
Just on the emotions thing, because like women are repeatedly associated with emotions. There's some really interesting research that says in workplaces, the reason women are being associated with emotions is because of all of those expressions that you've just talked about. But actually, in a number of studies, the evidence is that men are actually more emotional at work, but we've normalized anger from men.
Yeah,
we haven't normalized anger from women. And I think that that's really powerful because there's something in, and I'm just looking at it in a male-female way for a second. If we think about how we've taught men to only have certain emotions and only share certain emotions and only express certain emotions, so the workplace is going to look out at odds in terms of what emotions who has and what's acceptable and not acceptable. And I find that really interesting, because then it comes to what we're expecting of people, what we're normalizing, what we're rejecting. Like it wouldn't be unusual for me to hear from someone, if a male colleague or direct report came to them and was crying, they would immediately give time off and deal with the situation. But it's not unusual for me to hear, she cries a lot though, or she was quite upset, she was crying, and it to not have the same reaction. And I suppose and equally, it's not unusual for me to hear, oh, that's just what he's like, that's fine, when somebody's really angry. When a woman is angry, hearing comments about her period usually, or jokes about menopause, or something that is basically saying, as opposed to it being how she feels, even if it's charged, it's pushed into this area that we don't really talk about. I think just in terms of workplaces, what I often kind of try to focus on with this stuff is, if you can set up a best case scenario design, you will then probably not meet the design, but you'll do a lot better than you are now. And what I mean by that is, like, flexible working, if you've thought about it and you've designed it into your structure in some way, then you're more likely to meet more needs than you currently do. But you're not going to meet all the needs still, right? Like, there's lots of things, because the dynamic reoccurring of issues. So just from a workplace point of view, the purpose of setting up a really good design for these things is so that you can improve what you're doing. But it isn't to suggest you're going to get it all right. And I think that that's where we can go wrong in organizations. We think we should design it so it's like 0% fail, it's 100% effective. But for things like this, because of the dynamic nature, because of the social impact, because of a person's own relationship with what they're experiencing, that's very unlikely to ever be 100%. But what you can do is improve it and have a design in terms of flexible working and boundaries and things that helps. And like one of the ones I use, identity does not matter in this, I often encourage managers to do a work with me document. So they do it for their team. It's less than an A4, but if their team are comfortable, I ask them to do the same. Now, why this is important is, it's a guidance about how to work with me. I can't even remember who coined this, right? It's a guidance about how to work with me. It's not about why. So for instance, I might say in my work, in my work with me document, short, curt emails are not a tone, they're efficiency, right?
Yeah.
There are certain times of the month where I have less emotional energy to remember to put, how are you, how are the kids, like, or whatever. But instead of me saying that some months that, some points in the month will be better or worse, I'm just saying do not associate meaning to a curt email, like to a
Yeah,
short
you
email.
don't have to. Yeah, because they can't remember exactly like where you are in your feelings,
And
right? That's
I
something that we
don't
just have
remember
to.
half the time, you know.
Yeah,
So
yeah, no,
work
that'd be
keeping
too much work.
documents, yeah, it's so smart
Yeah.
because you can look at the behaviors or the relationships or the moments that might break you down with someone, you know, and
Mm,
might harm relationships or put you under pressure. And you can communicate it without going into any whys. And this can just
mhm,
be FYI.
mhm,
Another one I really like is like, depending on your sleeping pattern, I might say, you know, I sometimes solve problems at 3 a.m. Right? Like that doesn't mean I want you to solve the problem at 3 a.m., but it might mean that in the morning I'm not solving the problem. And then, you know, I give it space, I've mulled it over, I've reflected, and then the solution emerges. And I might need to tell you straight away, i.e., put it in an
mm.
email, because if I don't capture, I might lose it.
Yeah, mhm.
No, I tend not to send them. I schedule them. But before that was kind of like normalized.
Yeah.
So there are really subtle things, but there's a particular time of the month where 3 a.m. ideas come. And
Mm,
it's usually kind of during the upsurge of energy, I just have a little bit more. But then
mm.
come 8 o'clock another weeknight, and I'm like, I can't do that. So a
Yeah.
work document for everyone is really strategic, because whether they have a disability or a learning difference, or
Mm,
you know, a particular way of processing thought. So I say to people, like, you can write me long emails, but verbal will speed us up.
mm,
Um, you know, it's really effective because you're not actually making some big wide company statement. You're not doing something on your record. You're just sharing with people how to best work with you, and you're taking into account the times you need that consideration. And if you don't want to share it with your colleagues, even just your manager can make a
mm.
difference.
I
Even
think
like, because I know we've talked about, like, are you a morning person in the midday, and
yeah.
even saying mornings are not my best time, or evenings are not, like, it's just a game changer for understanding instead of diagnosis, pathologizing, or oversharing, you know.
I think so, yeah. I think it's actually lovely, Sheila. And also now that you say it, I'm thinking to myself, because I know for myself, and I know it might be true for a lot of other people, to sit down for 20 minutes and think about those things. There would probably be things on that list that I never really normalized for myself before, you know, like things I might have kind of dismissed or even shamed myself out of or ignored, or, you know, and you can kind of start to have these light bulb moments of, oh, yeah, like I do actually work well in the evenings. Oh, yeah, sometimes I do wake up in the middle of the night with an idea for something. And oh, yeah, maybe that is just my brain processing, and I can start to work with that. And that can be really helpful, you know. And another thing as well that I've seen can be really helpful for teams, if they choose to have an open sort of conversation policy around women's health or the menstrual cycle, is maybe not necessarily taking responsibility for people's emotions, but to have a check-in, you know, to have a little check-in, like, how are you, like, you know, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And then someone might say, oh, I'm, you know, they might, for whatever reason, I'm not feeling the best today, but like, it's just there, you know, and that they can mind themselves, and just to kind of like acknowledge that all of us are going through things all the time, depending on lots of different factors, and will impact our emotions and how we relate to that, you know. And just, it's nice to be able to like just put how you feel on the table without it having to be someone's responsibility or a problem. But it's just, and even it can just be over there, you know, and I don't have to feel like I have to mask then for the rest of the day, you know.
And there's something in this, and I hate whenever we talk about women's health to then be like, oh, and men, because it's like we don't do that when we talk about men. But there's a piece that I think is really important, and I only spoke to someone yesterday who did a PhD around what first time fathers' experiences of like
Mm,
parenthood,
mm,
and one of the gaps constantly, and maybe it's because I have a systemic view on organizations,
mm,
is understanding that by maintaining some of the inequality that men face in the workplace and non-binary people, we actually maintain it for everyone. And the example that you've just given, there's two things. One is there was somebody when I worked in the children's hospital for a little bit, and she did this lovely thing that before we ever spoke about tasks, we gave a check-in about where we were. And that
mm.
wasn't, this is why. So it would be like, oh, I'm burdened down today, or oh, I have a sense of this, or oh, look, I'm feeling like we're not getting anywhere. It was just wherever our state of being was. And it didn't, gender was not relevant. It was, what
Yeah.
was relevant was, do we know where you are today, so that as we interact with you, we are interacting with
Just be
that
aware.
knowledge,
Yeah.
internalizing, ignoring, like assuming that that's just who you are, you know. But the
Yeah.
other, so, and it worked really, really well most of the time. I think once or twice it didn't. And in fairness, it didn't work well because there was some background politics I wasn't aware of, but like it was evident when, you know, so people didn't want to say. But one of the things I really like is a battery system. So like,
yeah,
obsession with traffic lights. So thankfully I've moved on to a battery, right? But what I like about the battery is you could get a team. So instead of just everyone saying their own battery and percentage or whatever, you get the team to agree what the colors mean, and you know, so that when I say I'm at 40, we all know that that 40 means the same thing. Whereas what we can kind of do is, you know, I'll be like, oh, I'm at 40 and this means this for me. And then people are like, well, 40 is different for me. So if you can get a small team, or even you yourself decides, look, I'm a manager, this is what 90 means to me. This is, so when you answer, use this measure, so that while it is qualitative, there's a quantitative piece that we're all talking about the same way of measuring ish.
Yeah.
Energy and feelings. But it's really, really powerful because it starts to normalize, you know, conversations that we're just not having, but also it stops us going into some weird therapeutic space in the workplace.
Yeah.
Appropriate. So if I'm like, oh, I'm at green, I'm good, I'll probably get 3 hours out of this.
Yeah.
Then like, you got 3 hours of green, great. But if I'm like, I'm at red, I'm going to survive today, people are like, we will only give you the necessities that have to be delivered because you're not going to do a great job with some of these creative pieces or whatever. And that is really, really valuable, to have shared language that isn't gendered and isn't related to like conditions or legislation, but is actually, how do I let people know my experience without the why? And I think that that's really important because we have a history of unpacking the why in workplaces, and it's not always appropriate. You know, if I want to tell my friend, my manager, that's fine. But what I found is if somebody's not feeling great, the question is, what's wrong with her? What's wrong with him?
Yeah.
Privacy piece here, where if they
Yeah.
want you to know, they'll tell you. But what if they don't want you to know? But they want you to know where they're at because they're working with you, but they don't want you to know about the fight with the husband, or, you know, the pending considerations of divorce, or the horrible, you know, they don't want you to know, or just they woke up feeling crap, or they're comparing themselves to everyone today and they need to bring it to their therapist. Like, they don't want to tell you that. So whenever we normalize boundary needs conversations, I think we improve the experience for everyone involved. And when we ignore women's health or women's issues or women's needs, we actually also ignore the impact that has on non-binary people and people identifying. Because the reality is that when any need is not acceptable, we have a needs issue. Do you know what I mean? We have like a taboo around needs. Now, the other side of that is we need to make sure that it's appropriate in the workplace. So, like, what I mean by that is you might have a need that you need to show up and help yourself with in some way as well. Or you might want your organization to do something and it's not really within their remit. And that does happen. There's a lot of projection in workplaces. So workplaces can ignore the humanity of people. People can also ignore the humanity of the workplace in terms of like, there's lots you can't do in a workplace for lots of. But I think some explicit measures like the batteries or the conversations like you've said, I think those things help normalize needs without the gossipy or the extra or the privacy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. In my work, I know you know this, but in my work, we talk about your inner seasons. And actually that analogy can be used in the same way. It's like, you know, the seasons of the year, you might feel like, if you think about the energy of the season, so winter is the time when nature is sleeping and underground and quiet. And then spring, you have this emergence of energy. And then summer, it's high energy. And then autumn is kind of coming back into itself, into winter. And you can also apply those just to how you feel. It doesn't have to be anything to do with your hormones. Yeah, it can be like
seasons instead of battery, because batteries are a bit like technical.
Oh no, the batteries go too, but it's just another analogy.
I like that.
Because even the seasons, like the circadian rhythm men have a daily cycle. They they have a cycle. so their season, it could be like there's, and even for me, if I think about my own sleep cycle, I feel kind of delicate in the mornings. It's kind of a spring type energy. And then midday would be kind of more summer energy in that sense. And then as I'm then coming, into the early evening, it would be kind of autumn winding down time, and to normalize that kind of like cyclicality in even within the day. Because with the battery system, it's really good. But then I have days where I could be green, and then suddenly I'm just like, oh, I'm now going to be on red or amber, And I've also seen workplaces that use things like Slack. They might have an emoji or something beside their name or their little thing to kind of just a little indicator in terms of their season or how they feel, or I don't know. I quite like that idea. It's kind of fun. Yeah.
And I love the idea of the moving, because I think people assume you start in green and you end, but like for lots of reasons, lots of people don't start on green, you know, for loads of valid reasons, whether it's that they didn't sleep or they're worried or they do have a disability or they're experiencing a hormonal or physical shift. But the idea that we normalize identifying it, I think, is really, really powerful. But like just before we finish, an example is we scheduled this on purpose for 12:30. So like we didn't force it in the morning or do it later on the day, because you know what time you work well at, and I know that after kind of a certain time of the day I'm not going to be able to hold my focus as well. And that's like a really subtle thing, and I was saying this to someone recently. I avoid all types of public stuff. There's like a 24-hour point in every month that is not a good time for me to be public, because I spend the week criticizing myself for that, even though it's no different to the other 24 hours, but hormonally it is different. So so it's just not worth the additional energy. But the other thing is that I also try my best to be working from home on my cycle, because it just makes my life as in when it just makes my life easier. Now I want to have to tell people that. No, like I tell some people, I have some friends, even some male friends, I'd say are fed up of knowing about my cycle, because I'm like trying to train them for their future relationships, right? And that comes from, I learned that from you. I was like, why are we not normalizing it? But there's loads of spaces and even other generations, because I've spoken to older women, say, I don't want to talk about this in workplaces, which is okay. And then often they're experiencing menopause and they're like, I don't want to talk about it, but it's causing me real issues. I was able to manage my menstrual cycle for whatever reason. I had some skills and I could do it, but now I'm forgetting words, or I'm sweating, and I'm talking about being hot, and then I realize no one else is. And so at that point, there's a exposure for them as well. And they might not want to talk about it. So I do think that we need to be careful about rules and policies, especially when policies require identification. And I'd like to see more policies around like flexibility, support for managers, policies when you know that managers don't have the skill set to implement the policy. So then it's worth having a policy written so it's a standard they have to meet. But I like the ideas of being needs led, I think, because it matches our current legislation, but also it matches the social and humanistic lens of everyone's just a person.
100%.
So could we just like think about what people need to be able to do their jobs well? Because most people want to do their jobs well.
It's true.
Like norm.
There's so much to think about, and I'd be curious to hear how other people think, and like send us a message, leave a comment, because I love speaking to groups in workspaces and getting them to think about these things and think about it through the lens of their working hours and their structure, because it's going to be different depending on where you work as well and how you can implement different things. So I think it is a lot of food for thought, for sure, Sheila.
And I think you're right, depending on where they work. That's like, there's some people like Gardaí in Ireland, nurses, they won't have the same flexibility.
No, airline staff,
that somebody else might have in a traditional office. So I do think that we also need to broaden that conversation.
Yes, absolutely, because I don't think there was one right answer. Hence our discussion at the start about the question. So anyway.
Okay, well, we better end it there because we've gone over, which I'm not surprised at. But everybody, there's links below anyway to follow up with us, and do tag us if you have any questions or comments, because we'd be really interested in, and also maybe you're doing something in a workplace that's really working or not. Let us know as well, because it will help us both kind of conceptualize, because there is a really important context to each solution. We can't just rinse and repeat, I don't think.
I love collecting ideas that different workplaces are doing. I always find that really helpful.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.